My name is Elena, and I am 47 years old. My life is, for lack of a better word, predictable. I live alone in a modest apartment, surrounded by the quiet comfort of bookshelves and carefully tended plants. My days follow a rhythm: mornings with coffee by the window, afternoons teaching at the local college, evenings spent in solitude. It's not a bad life, but it's safe. Too safe, perhaps. It was a Wednesday afternoon when my predictable world was shaken. I had stopped by my favorite café, a small corner spot with wooden tables and soft jazz playing in the background. It was my little escape, a place where I could sip my latte and let the world blur around me. That's when I saw him. He was sitting near the window, sunlight filtering through the glass and casting a warm glow around him. He looked young, mid-20s, perhaps, with unruly dark hair and a confidence in the way he carried himself. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the edge of his coffee cup as he scrolled through his phone, a small smile playing on his lips. I don't know what it was about him that caught my attention. Maybe it was the ease in his movements or the way he seemed utterly at home in the world. Whatever it was, I couldn't look away. For a moment, I felt ridiculous, like a schoolgirl with a crush. But there was something about him, something that tugged at a part of me I thought I had buried long ago. It wasn't just attraction, it was curiosity, a longing to know what made him smile like that, what thoughts filled his mind as he sat there, so unaware of the world around him. I stayed longer than usual that day, sipping my coffee slowly, my gaze flickering between the book in my hands and the stranger by the window. When he finally stood to leave, I felt a pang of disappointment, as though I had lost something precious without ever really having it. But instead of letting the moment pass, something inside me stirred. A quiet voice whispered, "Follow him." It was absurd, impulsive, entirely unlike me. But as he walked out the door, I found myself gathering my things and slipping out after him, keeping a careful distance. That was the beginning that I told myself it wasn't stalking. It was curiosity. Innocent, harmless curiosity. The young man with the radiant smile and easy demeanor had ignited something in me that I hadn't felt in years. So, as I followed him that first day, I felt more like a detective than anything else. He walked at an unhurried pace, weaving through the bustling streets as though he had all the time in the world. I kept a safe distance, pretending to browse shop windows or check my phone whenever he paused. It felt surreal, like I had stepped into a different life, one where I was bold enough to pursue a stranger. He stopped at a bookstore, one of those charming little shops with creaky wooden floors and shelves packed to the ceiling. I hesitated outside, my heart pounding, before slipping inside. I watched him from a distance as he browsed the fiction section, his fingers trailing along the spines of books. He seemed so at ease, so engrossed in his own world, that I felt a pang of envy. After a while, he left the bookstore with a small bag in hand and headed to a nearby park. I followed, taking a seat on a bench far enough away to avoid suspicion but close enough to observe. He sat under a tree, pulling a book from the bag and beginning to read. The sight of him so absorbed, with the golden afternoon light casting shadows across his face, made my breath catch. The next day, I went back to the café, hoping to see him again. To my delight and relief, he was there, seated at the same table by the window. This time, I didn't hesitate. I took a seat nearby, close enough to watch him without being obvious. I noticed the small details, the way he stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, the way he ran a hand through his hair when he was deep in thought, the faint smile that lingered on his lips as he read something on his phone. He seemed happy, content in a way that was magnetic. When he left, I followed again. This time, he went to a small diner, ordering a simple meal and eating alone, as if lost in his own thoughts. I couldn't help but wonder what kind of life he lived, what stories he carried within him. By the third day, my curiosity had only grown. I returned to the cafe once more, and there he was, as though the universe had conspired to bring us together. This time, I noticed something different. His eyes lingered on me for just a moment longer than before. When he smiled, it felt deliberate, like it was meant for me. My heart raced at the thought. Was it possible he had noticed me? That he could sense my quiet fascination? For the first time in years, I felt alive, like I was standing on the edge of something extraordinary. By the third day, my routine had transformed entirely. The café was no longer just a place for coffee. It was the stage for this strange, unspoken dance. I arrived earlier than usual, my nerves taut with anticipation, and when I saw him walk in, I felt an inexplicable wave of relief, as though the world had set itself right. I chose my seat carefully, close enough to observe, but not so close as to be obvious. He ordered his coffee, just like the past 2 days, and settled into his usual spot by the window. For a while, he seemed absorbed in his book, the same worn paperback I'd seen him carry before. And then it happened. His eyes lifted, scanning the room briefly before they landed on me. It was a fleeting moment, but it sent a jolt through me. His gaze didn't waver. Instead, it softened, his lips curling into a faint smile. My heart stuttered in my chest. I quickly looked down at my cup, trying to compose myself. When I dared to glance back, he was still looking. This time, there was something deliberate in his expression, a quiet acknowledgement that sent a shiver down my spine. As the minutes passed, I felt the atmosphere shift. It was as though the space between us had come alive, buzzing with an energy that was both thrilling and unnerving. I tried to focus on my book, but the words blurred together. All I could think about was him. When he finally rose to leave, he did something unexpected. As he passed my table, he paused, just for a moment. His eyes met mine again, and he gave me a small, lingering smile before walking out the door. I sat frozen, replaying the moment in my mind. That smile, it was unmistakable. It wasn't casual or indifferent. It was purposeful, meant for me. For the first time, I felt the possibility that he might have noticed me just as I had noticed him. That evening, as I sat at home, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every glance, every smile, every shared moment felt like a piece of a puzzle I was desperate to complete. I began to imagine what it would be like to speak to him, to hear his voice, to know what thoughts filled his mind. But with those thoughts came fear. What was I doing? He was younger, a stranger, someone who likely lived in a world so different from mine. And yet, the thought of walking away from this, whatever this was, felt unbearable. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. If there was even the slightest chance that he felt what I felt, I owed it to myself to find out. The next morning, I woke with a resolve I hadn't felt in years. It was a strange mix of determination and terror that pulsed through me as I prepared for the day. This was the day I would act, not just watch, not just wonder. I arrived at the café early, my heart hammering in my chest as I settled into my usual spot. Minutes ticked by like hours, and then, as if on cue, he walked in. The sight of him sent a familiar warmth rushing through me, a blend of relief and exhilaration. He glanced in my direction as he approached the counter, his lips curving into that same knowing smile that had haunted my thoughts all night. This time, I held his gaze for a moment longer than I had before. Something passed between us, an unspoken understanding that made my pulse quicken. As he sat down at his usual table, I knew it was now or never. If I let this moment slip away, I would regret it for the rest of my life. Taking a deep breath, I rose from my seat, clutching my coffee cup like a lifeline. My legs felt unsteady as I crossed the room, but I forced myself to keep going, step by step, until I stood before him. He looked up, his eyes wide with surprise that quickly softened into something warmer. "Hi," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. I couldn't help but notice you've been coming here a lot. I thought I'd say hello." A flicker of amusement crossed his face, but it wasn't mocking, it was kind, inviting. "Hello," he replied, his voice smooth and calm. "I guess I've noticed you, too." His words hit me like a lightning bolt, and I struggled to keep my composure. "I was wondering," I began, my nerves threatening to overwhelm me, "if you'd like to come over for dinner sometime. I know it's a bit forward, but I'd like to get to know you." He seemed taken aback for a moment, but then his smile deepened, and he nodded. "I'd like that," he said simply. The relief that flooded through me was almost dizzying. We exchanged numbers, and I gave him my address. As I walked back to my seat, I felt a strange mix of triumph and disbelief. I had done it. I had taken the leap. That evening, I busied myself preparing for his arrival. I cooked a simple but elegant meal, setting the table with my finest dishes and lighting a few candles to create a warm, inviting atmosphere. Every detail felt like a reflection of my hopes and fears, a quiet prayer for what the night might bring. When the doorbell rang, my heart leapt into my throat. Taking a steadying breath, I opened the door to find him standing there, a bottle of wine in hand and that same smile that had drawn me to him in the first place. "Hi," he said, his voice laced with a hint of shyness. "Hi," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. As I closed the door behind him, I couldn't help but feel that this was the start of something extraordinary. The evening unfolded in a way I hadn't expected. The nerves that had plagued me earlier in the day seemed to dissolve the moment he stepped inside. There was an ease between us, a quiet rhythm that settled over the room like a soft melody. He complimented the setting, his eyes soft as he looked around, and we found ourselves sinking into easy conversation. At first, the chatter was light. We spoke about the books we loved, our favorite places to travel, and the strange coincidences of life. Every word he spoke was measured, thoughtful, as though he was carefully revealing pieces of himself, just as I was. It was like we were both aware that something deeper was unfolding, but neither of us rushed to name it. When the meal was over, and the last of the wine had been poured, I found myself leaning back, my heart still racing but somehow calmer than it had been earlier. The space between us had closed, and now there was no denying it. There was a pull, an undeniable tension that hummed in the air, electric and alive. He stood, moving to the small window by the dining table, looking out at the city lights. I watched him, captivated by the grace of his movements, the way he seemed at home in the space, as if he belonged here. He turned to face me then, and our eyes met across the room, long, searching, like we were both trying to understand what was happening between us. Without a word, he crossed the room, his presence undeniable, until he stood before me. My breath hitched, and for a moment, I could only look up at him, feeling the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. His hand brushed my cheek, his touch light but firm, grounding me in this shared moment. "You're beautiful," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. I felt the words wrap around me like a delicate, fragile thread, drawing me closer to him. The world outside faded into a distant hum, and in that instant, it was just the two of us, standing at the edge of something unknown, something inevitable. His lips brushed mine for the first time, soft, tentative, as if testing the waters. My heart raced, but I couldn't pull away. Instead, I kissed him back, slowly, letting the weight of everything I had held inside spill out in that one simple touch. The kiss deepened, and suddenly, everything felt right. My body responded to him with a certainty I hadn't known in years. The years of quiet routine, of solitude, seemed to fall away with each passing second, replaced by something raw, something alive. He pulled back briefly, his forehead resting against mine, his breath shallow. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice hushed, like he was afraid to break the magic. I met his gaze, feeling my heart swell with emotions I hadn't known I could still feel. "Yes," I whispered, "I'm sure." And then, without another word, he kissed me again, and I knew there was no turning back. This connection, unexpected, fierce, and all-consuming, was something I hadn't anticipated, but something I would never let go of. The night stretched on, the moments between us slipping by like smooth, gentle waves. Each touch, each glance felt more profound than the last, as though we were exploring an uncharted world, both eager and uncertain. I had never imagined something like this could happen, never thought I'd be here, in this small, intimate space with him. As the evening wore on, I found myself reflecting on everything that had led me here. It was easy to let the passion take over, to surrender to the connection we'd sparked. But as the night grew quieter, I started to feel the weight of reality creeping back in. He sat beside me on the couch, his hand gently resting on my knee. His touch was warm, comforting, but it also stirred something deep inside me, a longing I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. My mind, however, was racing. This wasn't supposed to happen, I reminded myself. He was younger, so much younger. What would people think? What would they say? And yet, here we were. It felt as though the world had narrowed down to just this room, this moment. "I never expected this," he murmured, his voice soft as he gazed at me. "I didn't know if I was just imagining things at first, but you feel it too, don't you?" I turned to face him, finding truth in his eyes, in the sincerity that danced there. "I do," I whispered. The words were a confession, a surrender, but they were also freeing. He smiled, his hand brushing a strand of hair from my face. "I'm glad," he said, his voice deepening slightly. "I didn't want to push you. I didn't want to rush anything. But I feel it too." A part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Here I was, so much older than him, having spent a lifetime trying to build a life of safety and routine. And yet, in this moment, I felt more alive than I had in years. He was the spark I didn't know I'd been missing, the breath of fresh air that shattered all my carefully constructed walls. And yet, fear lingered, a quiet shadow at the edges of my mind. What would tomorrow look like? Could this really work? Was it possible for something so intense, so unexpected, to last? As if reading my thoughts, he took my hand, his grip steady and reassuring. "I don't know where this is going," he said quietly, "but I want to find out with you." His words were simple, but they held so much weight. It wasn't the certainty of forever he was offering. It wasn't a promise of a fairy tale. It was something far more precious, a willingness to be in the moment, to explore what could be, no matter how uncertain it seemed. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. It didn't matter what others might think. It didn't matter what I thought. What mattered was that I had the courage to follow my heart, to embrace this connection, this love, despite the odds. As we sat together in the soft glow of the evening, I understood that love was not something that could be planned or predicted. It wasn't about age or societal norms. It was about the depth of connection, the willingness to open oneself to another, even when the path ahead was unclear. This was the beginning of something I could never have imagined, but something I was willing to embrace, no matter where it might lead. The days that followed were a blur of moments, shared laughter, whispered conversations, and quiet mornings spent tangled in the sheets. It was as though time itself had slowed down, stretching out each second until it felt eternal. We found ourselves navigating the newness of what we had together, both tentative and bold in our own ways. But even amidst the warmth of our connection, doubt still gnawed at the edges of my mind. I had opened myself up to him in ways I never thought possible, and yet, I couldn't shake the worry that this was all too fleeting. Could someone like me, someone who had spent so many years living in the shadows of routine, really be part of something so wild, so unpredictable? One evening, as we sat on the couch, my thoughts spilled out before I could stop them. "Do you think that this could last?" He looked at me with those steady eyes, those eyes that had seen past the surface of who I was and had found something worth holding on to. His response was slow, deliberate, as if weighing each word carefully. "I don't know, but I don't think it's about lasting forever or fitting into a mold. It's about now, about what we have right here, right now." His hand found mine, his thumb brushing over my knuckles in that familiar, comforting way. "Isn't that enough?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to say that the present, this moment, was all that mattered. But the voice in my head, the one that always insisted on caution, on measuring the future against my fears, spoke louder than my heart. "I don't know," I whispered. "I just keep thinking about what people would say if they knew about the age difference, about us." He sighed, his grip tightening ever so slightly. "Let them say whatever they want. What matters is what we have, what we feel." His words, simple as they were, calmed something inside me. I realized that I had been living my life based on what others expected, based on the rules that had been written for me without my consent. But now, with him, I was finally living for myself. As the days passed, the weight of my fears began to lift. I stopped worrying about the future and allowed myself to just be, to savor the quiet moments with him, to enjoy the closeness that had bloomed between us without questioning whether it would fade. He never pressured me. He never made me feel like I needed to make any grand decisions. He just allowed me to exist in this space with him, and that was more than I had ever known how to ask for. And one morning, as we lay together in the stillness of dawn, I realized something. I wasn't just rediscovering love in him, I was rediscovering myself. I was learning that it was okay to take risks, to defy expectations, to let go of the rules that had defined my life for so long. For the first time in years, I felt alive. The days and weeks that followed were a revelation. I stopped watching the clock, stopped measuring the time between moments with him. Each day felt like a new chapter in a book I hadn't expected to open, one filled with twists and turns I hadn't anticipated but was eager to experience. And yet, even in the joy of our connection, there were moments of reflection, quiet moments when I would find myself lost in thought, wondering about the path ahead. I had always lived by rules, by expectations. Society had told me what was acceptable, what was not. But with him, those rules seemed distant, irrelevant. What mattered was the depth of what we shared, the bond we had created in such an unexpected and beautiful way. I had questioned, at first, whether this was just a fleeting passion, something that would fade as quickly as it had started. But each day, I was proven wrong. The connection between us grew stronger, deeper, richer. It wasn't about age or appearance or the past. It was about us, two people who had found something extraordinary in each other. One evening, as we sat in the quiet of my living room, our hands intertwined, he looked at me with a softness in his eyes that made my heart swell. "I don't know where this is going," he said, his voice steady, but there was a hint of vulnerability there. "But I want to be here with you, wherever that might be." And in that moment, I realized something that I had never fully understood until now. Love was not about guarantees. It was not about the future or about fitting into some predetermined mold. Love was about being present, about living in the moment, and trusting that the connection you shared was worth everything, even the uncertainties. I smiled at him, my heart full. "I don't know where this is going either, but I'm ready to see where it leads." And so we moved forward together, step by step. There were no grand declarations of forever, no promises that could never be fully kept. What we had was real, and that was enough. I had rediscovered something within myself, something I had forgotten in the years of routine and silence. I had rediscovered my capacity for passion, for connection, for love. And in rediscovering that part of myself, I had found the courage to step outside the boundaries of what I thought I knew. It didn't matter what anyone else thought. It didn't matter the years between us. What mattered was this moment, this connection, this love. This was my journey, and it was only just beginning.